The French and Indian War by David Yu. So first off, contrary to popular belief, the French and Indian, not those Indians. The French and Indian War wasn't a war between the French and Native Americans. It was actually a series of clashes between the colonists from Britain against the combined forces of the French and some Native American tribes. The fact that we still call Native Americans Indians still shows how ignorant we are today. So both England and France were expanding into each other's land, and this led to many problems. An example of this conflict was the Ohio River Valley, more specifically, a river junction called the Forks of the Ohio. Eventually, the French attacked the fort at Pickawillany, established by fur traders, and drove the British out. And the British were not happy with this. In retaliation, the British captured Louisbourg, north of Nova Scotia, but later they returned Louisbourg to France. So things are getting pretty heated, and this is when the Native Americans come into play. The Native Americans sided with the French as they had a better relationship with them, which led to the raids of many British settlements. At this point, the British have sprung into action. The Virginia governor, Robert Dinwiddie, sends none other than George Washington to drive the French out. However, this George Washington is young and inexperienced, unprepared for battle. George Washington and his men establish Fort Necessity nearby. The French have already established Fort Duquesne nearby and surround Fort Necessity. A fight ensues, the French ending up victorious. The French force Washington to surrender, and the French eventually let George Washington go. The British try to take over Fort Duquesne, this time led by General Edward Braddock, a well-renowned general in the British Army, and supported by George Washington. However, the British made the mistake of practicing gentleman's warfare. This was basically when the army of soldiers stood in a line in front of the enemy and took turns shooting each other. The French and Native Americans practiced guerrilla warfare instead, sniping at the British and dashing from tree to tree. Braddock himself was killed in the slaughter, very few British escaping. George Washington escaped alive, having 4 bullets go through his coat during the battle. This monstrous defeat triggered Britain to wage war on France, starting the 7 Years' War. The outcome seemed dark for the British, until a man named William Pitt came to power. Pitt invested heavily on war supplies, even getting his own country into debt. However, Britain was now winning the war all over the world, such as the colonies, Philippines, Africa, Spain, England, and many more. So they really didn't care if they were in debt. Britain attacked Fort Duquesne once more, and this time they successfully captured the fort, renaming it Fort Pitt. From then on, the British had more victories, even defeating the army at Quebec, which was the capital of New France and thought impossible to attack. Eventually, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and both the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War ended. Britain gained Canada and most of the lands east of the Mississippi River from France. After the war, the King of Britain imposed the Proclamation of 1763, which stated that the Appalachian Mountains were a temporary border, halting the colony's growth in colonial America to stop further fights with the indigenous Native Americans. This angered the colonists, being one of the sparks that ignited the American Revolution. The people that suffered the most damage and pain were the Native Americans. They were mistreated and they lost their land. This still happens today. The Dakota pipeline is being protested by tribal people as oil companies are going to build the pipeline straight into a water reservoir, causing the risk of a leak and the contamination of the water that many people use. If this doesn't sit right with you and you feel that you need to do something about this, notify your social studies teacher and see what you could do. Let your social studies teacher do some homework for once. Stand in solidarity with the Native Americans and say no to DAPL.